Eleanor Ashford stood at the rain-streaked window of her cramped attic room in Boston, watching the gas lamps flicker to life along Beacon Hill. It was 1887, and the city below thrummed with the energy of the new industrial age, a world of opportunity that felt impossibly distant from her reality. At 28 years old, she had spent the last decade in quiet servitude, her voice reduced to whispers, her dreams compressed into the narrow confines of her employer's household. Her stepmother, Constance Ashford, had made certain that Eleanor's inheritance, the last vestige of her father's wealth, remained locked away in a trust she could not access until marriage or age 35. Constance wielded this knowledge like a weapon, ensuring Eleanor remained dependent, vulnerable, and utterly trapped. The household staff pitied her in ways that only deepened Eleanor's shame. They saw a woman who was neither servant nor family, caught in a liminal space where she belonged nowhere. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she adjusted the worn black dress hanging from her thin frame. The fabric had been fashionable once, perhaps, but years of patching and fading had reduced it to something closer to a servant's uniform than the garment of a gentleman's daughter. She had learned to make herself small, to move through rooms without drawing attention, to absorb criticism without flinching. Suffering had become her native language, spoken in the careful arrangement of flowers in her employer's drawing room, in the meals she prepared and served to others, in the endless needlework that left her fingers raw and bleeding. That morning, everything changed. A letter arrived, not for Eleanor, but for Constance. Eleanor discovered it by accident while tidying the morning room. The seal was impressive, bearing a crest she recognized from the society pages, the Duke of Harrington. Her hands shook as she placed it on the silver tray, though propriety demanded she ask no questions and reveal no curiosity. By evening, Constance's shrill voice echoed through the house. "Eleanor, come here at once!" Eleanor's heart seized with the familiar dread that accompanied any summons. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step an exercise in gathering courage. Inside Constance's bedroom, her stepmother sat perched on the velvet chaise like a predatory bird, the Duke's letter clutched in her jeweled fingers. "It seems," Constance said, her smile sharp as broken glass, "that the Duke of Harrington requires a companion for his ailing sister, a woman of refinement, well versed in discretion. The pay is substantial, $50 per month plus room and board at his estate on the North Shore." Eleanor's breath caught. $50, independence, escape. I have already accepted the position on your behalf," Constance continued, her eyes glinting with something Eleanor couldn't quite name. "He requires you to begin immediately. I suspect he intends to make the arrangement permanent, perhaps even find you a suitable match among his connections. Though between us, Eleanor, I cannot imagine who would have you. Still, you will go. You will be impeccably behaved, and you will not shame this family with any display of your difficulties." Eleanor understood what difficulties Constance meant, her tendency to speak truth, her resistance to manipulation, the faint rebelliousness that had never quite been beaten out of her despite years of effort. 3 days later, Eleanor found herself on the train heading north, a small leather suitcase containing everything she owned resting at her feet. Through the window, she watched Boston recede into the distance, wondering if she was escaping one prison only to enter another. The Harrington estate materialized through the autumn mist like something from a Gothic novel, all granite towers and tall windows perched on cliffs overlooking the Atlantic. Eleanor's stomach turned as the carriage wound up the private drive. She had been promised $50 and escape, but she hadn't considered what might come with a man powerful enough to command the immediate obedience of someone like Constance. A butler met her at the threshold. "Miss Ashford, the Duke is expecting you in his study. He wishes to assess your suitability for the position personally." Eleanor's hands trembled as she followed him through corridors of dark wood and hunting portraits. Each step felt weighted with significance, though she couldn't say why. The study door opened onto a room of impressive proportions, dominated by a fireplace and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. And there, silhouetted against the window with its view of churning ocean, stood the man who would change everything. The Duke turned to face her, and Eleanor's carefully constructed composure nearly shattered. She had expected someone cold, distant, wielding authority like a cudgel. Instead, she encountered eyes of remarkable gentleness, intelligent, observant, containing depths of understanding that seemed impossible in a man of his station. He was perhaps 40, with silver threading through dark hair at the temples, his features marked by lines of accumulated sorrow rather than cruelty. "Miss Ashford," he said, his voice low and measured, "I am Marcus Harrington. Please sit." Eleanor perched on the edge of a leather chair, her back ramrod straight, her hands folded precisely in her lap, all the careful postures of someone trained not to take up space. "Your stepmother provided a glowing reference," the Duke continued, settling into his own chair. "She assured me of your discretion, your reliability, your ability to adapt to household management. She painted quite a picture of competence." He paused, and something flickered across his face, a recognition, perhaps, or a calculation. "And yet, when I look at you, Miss Ashford, I see something else entirely." Eleanor's throat tightened. "Sir, I see someone who has learned to be invisible," he said quietly. "Someone whose spirit has been systematically diminished. I wonder if Mrs. Ashford's glowing reference was actually a warning disguised as praise." Eleanor couldn't breathe. No one had ever spoken to her with such directness, such acknowledgement of the truth she lived within every moment. "My sister Catherine is unwell," the Duke continued, apparently unaware of the earthquake occurring inside Eleanor's chest. "Not physically, though her health is delicate. She suffers from what the physicians call melancholia, a profound depression that has isolated her for the past 2 years. She requires someone who understands suffering, who will not judge her for her darkness, and who will not pretend that pretty platitudes and forced cheerfulness constitute genuine help." He leaned forward slightly. "I believe you may be precisely such a person, but I need to know. Are you here because you wish to be, or because you have been sent?" The question hung in the air between them like an offered hand. Eleanor considered lying. It would have been the safe choice, the prudent one. Instead, something inside her, some small, defiant flame that Constance had never quite managed to extinguish, refused the deception. "I was sent," she admitted. "My stepmother accepted the position for me without my knowledge, but She hesitated, then forced the words forward. "I'm grateful to be here. I needed to leave." The Duke nodded slowly, and his expression held no judgment, only understanding. "Then let me be clear about the terms of your employment. You will serve as Catherine's companion. You will listen to her without judgment. You will not attempt to cure her of her sadness. You will simply be present, and you will be safe here, Miss Ashford. I give you my word. You will not be treated as a servant, though you will work. You will be a member of this household." Over the following weeks, Eleanor discovered that the Duke's promise was not mere courtesy. She was shown to a proper bedroom with its own sitting room, given her own maid to assist her, and treated with a formality that initially made her deeply uncomfortable. Catherine Harrington, when she finally ventured from her darkened room to meet Eleanor, was a woman of perhaps 35, with her brother's sensitive eyes and an air of profound weariness. "I don't know why you're here," Catherine said bluntly when they first met. "My brother collects broken things, but he cannot fix me." Eleanor, sitting beside her in the library, replied with equal honesty, "Perhaps he doesn't believe you need fixing. Perhaps he simply believes you deserve not to be alone in your darkness." Something shifted in Catherine's expression, a crack in the wall she had constructed around herself. "Have you been alone in darkness?" she asked softly. "Every day of my life," Eleanor said, "until I came here." Their friendship began there, built on the foundation of shared understanding. Catherine slowly began to venture from her room more frequently. Eleanor prepared careful meals, suggested quiet activities, never pushing, never demanding, simply offering presence and acceptance. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the household rhythm changed. Catherine began to smile again, but it was the Duke who occupied Eleanor's thoughts in the hours when she lay alone in her bed. She would find him in the library late at night, reading by the fire, and he would look up as though he had been waiting for her. They developed a ritual of evening conversation, carefully proper, deeply intimate, in a way that had nothing to do with impropriety and everything to do with genuine recognition between two souls. "Tell me about your father," the Duke asked one evening, as they sat in companionable silence. Eleanor spoke of her father, his kindness, his early death, the promises he had made that no one had kept. The Duke listened with complete attention, never interrupting, never offering false comfort. When Eleanor finally fell silent, tears streaming down her face, he simply handed her a handkerchief and waited. "My wife died 10 years ago," he said eventually. "Catherine nearly died with her. I have spent a decade trying to fix my sister's grief, when perhaps I simply needed to sit with her in it. You have taught me that, Eleanor, by simply being who you are." Eleanor's heart quickened at his use of her given name. "I have done nothing extraordinary. You have done something far more valuable," the Duke said quietly. "You have taught us that survival itself is extraordinary, that presence is more powerful than cure, that broken things do not always need fixing, they need witnessing." The autumn deepened into winter. Eleanor's dresses, once carefully repaired and faded, were replaced by new gowns of fine fabric. Her hair, which she had worn in a severe bun for years, was loosened by Catherine, who took delight in styling it in fashionable arrangements. Eleanor caught glimpses of herself in mirrors and almost did not recognize the woman looking back. This woman with light in her eyes, with flesh filling out her thin frame, with the incipient softness of someone learning to hope. But hope, Eleanor was discovering, was its own form of danger. December brought a letter from Boston. Eleanor recognized Constance's handwriting immediately and felt the old dread settle into her bones. The Duke found her in the morning room, the letter fallen from her trembling fingers. "What has happened?" he asked, helping her to a chair. Eleanor handed him the letter with shaking hands. His expression darkened as he read. Constance had learned that Eleanor had become well established in the Harrington household and was now claiming that Eleanor's inheritance, the trust that had been locked away for so long, was hers by right. She was threatening legal action to reclaim the funds, claiming Eleanor had been manipulated and coerced into signing documents transferring the trust to her family. It was all lies, of course, but lies wrapped in the language of law and property, which carried their own weight regardless of truth. More troubling still was Constance's implication that Eleanor's proximity to the Duke was inappropriate, that she had somehow seduced her way into his favor, and that any further contact between them would result in social scandal that would destroy them both. "This is blackmail," the Duke said coldly, setting the letter down. "It is the truth," Eleanor replied bitterly. "I am nobody. You are everything. Any connection between us can only be interpreted as what?" the Duke demanded. "I have taken no liberties with you, Eleanor. I have treated you with absolute propriety." "In private, perhaps," Eleanor said, her voice breaking. "But in society's eyes, the daughter of a nobody does not rise from companion to confidant, to something more without speculation and judgment, and they would be right to judge. I am not suitable. I am not of your world." The Duke stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "Do you think I care what society says? Do you think I would allow anyone to dictate whom I may know, whom I may value, whom I may—" He stopped himself, but the words hung unspoken in the space between them. That evening, a storm rolled in from the Atlantic with violent intensity. Wind and rain battered the windows as Eleanor sat alone in the library, trying to read but finding herself unable to concentrate. The door opened without a knock, and the Duke entered, his hair dishevelled, his eyes fierce with emotion he could no longer contain. "I will not lose you to fear," he said without preamble. not to Constance's lies, not to society's judgment, not to your own deeply ingrained belief that you do not deserve happiness. Eleanor rose, her heart pounding. "Your Grace—" "Marcus," he interrupted, "say my name." "Marcus," she whispered. "I have been alone for 10 years," he continued, closing the distance between them. "My wife was a dutiful companion, but we never truly knew each other. I thought that chapter of my life was closed, and then you arrived, terrified and broken, and bearing your suffering with such quiet grace that it took my breath away." He reached out and cupped her face gently, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "I love you, Eleanor. Not as a duke loves a companion, but as a man loves a woman. Completely, desperately. And I will not allow fear or propriety or anyone's judgment to prevent me from telling you so." Eleanor's world tilted. "You cannot. It is madness." "It is the sanest thing I have felt in a decade," Marcus said. "I am not asking you to decide anything now. I am simply asking you to stay, to let me love you, to discover whether this extraordinary connection between us might lead somewhere neither of us has dared to imagine." The kiss that followed was tender and profound, tasting of tears and salt and the rain that seemed to mirror the storm in Eleanor's heart. When it ended, Eleanor rested her forehead against his, unable to speak, unable to breathe, unable to process that the invisible chains she had worn for so long might finally be breaking. But the next morning brought consequences Eleanor had not anticipated. A telegram arrived from Boston. Constance was pressing legal charges. Eleanor's access to her inheritance was being frozen pending investigation. More devastating still, Constance was demanding that Eleanor return to Boston immediately or face the withdrawal of her reputation and the social ostracism of the entire Harrington family. "She has influence," Eleanor explained to Marcus in the privacy of his study. "Old money. Connections in all the right circles. A scandal involving you would destroy Catherine's prospects entirely. How could I do that to her? How could I do that to you?" "By leaving," Marcus said fiercely. "That is what you are suggesting, that you would leave to protect us. Eleanor, do you not see? She is using our deepest vulnerabilities, our love for those we care for, our fear of causing pain, to drive us apart." "Yes," Eleanor acknowledged. "And she will succeed because what she says contains the truth of how the world works. We cannot escape that, Marcus. We can only choose not to fight it." "I will not accept that," Marcus said. But Eleanor could see the fear in his eyes, the terrible knowledge that his love, his title, his vast wealth could not shield them from the machinery of societal judgment. Eleanor left Boston 2 days after the trial began, unable to bear the thought of staying in the city that had confined her for so long. The journey back to Harrington House felt like a pilgrimage. Each mile traveled another step closer to the person she had become in Marcus's presence. The letter had arrived the morning after her victory in court. Eleanor had read it 17 times before she could trust that it was real, not some dream conjured by her desperate heart. Marcus's words, "Let me be at last someone you can lean upon," had shattered something inside her, some final wall she didn't even know she'd been maintaining. She had hired a lawyer who fought with the ferocity of a man possessed. Constance's claims crumbled under scrutiny. The forged documents were exposed. The lies about Eleanor's mental state were revealed as what they were, the desperate grasping of a woman afraid of losing control. And when Eleanor testified, her voice steady and clear despite her trembling hands, something fundamental shifted in the courtroom. The judge's expression softened. The jury looked at her with recognition. She was no longer the invisible woman enduring in silence. She was a survivor, claiming her voice. The final decree came on a freezing February afternoon. Eleanor's inheritance was fully restored. Constance was ordered to pay restitution for defamation. More importantly, Eleanor was declared of sound mind and unimpeachable character, a document that felt like absolution for crimes she had never committed. That evening, Eleanor walked through Boston's frozen streets, past the townhouses where she had spent a decade in servitude, past the house where Constance now lived in diminished circumstances. She felt no triumph, only a profound exhaustion and a desperate longing for home, for the place where she had learned that broken things could still be beautiful, that suffering had meaning, that love was the most revolutionary act of all. The train journey north took 12 hours. Eleanor sat by the window, watching the landscape transform from urban grey to rural white, and she whispered prayers she had learned somewhere deep in her childhood, prayers she thought she'd forgotten, but that returned now with the familiarity of an old friend. When the carriage pulled up the drive of Harrington House, Eleanor's breath caught. Snow clung to the granite towers, and lights glowed warm in every window. The front door opened before the carriage came to a complete stop, and Marcus emerged without a coat, his breath visible in the frozen air. Eleanor descended with trembling legs. When their eyes met, she saw everything: his fear that she would not come, his love laid bare and vulnerable, his faith that somehow this impossible thing between them might become real. "You came," he said, and his voice broke on the words. "I came," Eleanor confirmed, and when he pulled her into his arms, it felt like coming home, like crossing a threshold from which there was no return, like choosing, finally and absolutely, to believe in redemption. Catherine stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face, her depression transformed into something lighter, something that resembled peace. "She's back," she whispered to no one in particular. "Eleanor, you came back." "I came back," Eleanor repeated, and this time it felt like a vow. They married in the chapel overlooking the Atlantic the following spring, on a day when the world exploded into bloom. Eleanor wore ivory silk that had been stitched with her grandmother's lace, a connection to the past that no longer defined her, but informed her, grounded her, made her real. Catherine served as witness, the transformation in her friend visible to everyone. The woman who had been drowning in melancholia now stood with her shoulders back and her eyes bright. When Marcus slipped the ring on Eleanor's finger, she thought of all the years she had made herself small, invisible, voiceless. She thought of Constance's cruel hands. She thought of the attic room and the worn dresses and the weight of being no one. And then she looked at Marcus's face, at the absolute certainty and tenderness there, and she understood that every moment of suffering had been necessary, had been the price required to become someone capable of recognizing true love when it arrived. That night, in the chambers they would share for the rest of their lives, Marcus held Eleanor as though she were made of light. His touch was reverent, his words poetry, not the formal language of society, but the raw, honest speech of a man overwhelmed by the reality of the woman he held. "I love you," he whispered against her hair, "not despite your suffering, not in spite of what you've endured, but because you've survived with grace intact, because you refused to let pain make you cruel, because you chose love when you could have chosen bitterness." Eleanor wept in his arms, not from sadness, but from release, from the profound understanding that she had finally, after all these years, come home, not to a place, but to a person, to a future, to herself. As dawn broke over the Atlantic, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Eleanor Ashford, now Duchess of Harrington, stood on their private balcony and watched the sun rise on a world transformed. The chains had not simply been broken. They had been transformed into something else entirely, into the passage that had carried her from suffering to redemption, from silence to voice, from invisibility to love. Marcus joined her at the railing, wrapping his coat around her shoulders. "What are you thinking?" he asked quietly. "That I was wrong," Eleanor said. "I thought redemption meant escape, that it meant leaving pain behind forever. But it's not that simple, is it?" "No," Marcus agreed. "Redemption is carrying what has wounded us and allowing it to teach us compassion. It's taking the scars and making them beautiful. It's choosing every day to believe that we are worthy of love despite or perhaps because of, everything we've endured. Eleanor turned to face him, and in the early morning light she saw the man who had witnessed her darkness and loved her anyway, who had offered her not rescue from reality, but partnership within it, who had taught her that strength was not the absence of suffering, but the courage to continue loving despite it. "I want to tell our story," Eleanor said suddenly. "I want to tell every woman who reads it that suffering does not define her worth. That invisibility can be broken. That voice, once found, cannot be silenced. That redemption is not about becoming someone else entirely. It's about finally becoming yourself." Marcus smiled, and in that smile, Eleanor saw their future unfold, not as a fairy tale without pain, but as something more valuable, a life built on truth, on survival, on the transformative power of choosing love despite fear. And so Eleanor began to write. Late into the night, with Marcus reading beside the fire, she put words to her journey. She wrote about the weight of silence and the courage required to break it. She wrote about a man who loved not her circumstances, but her essence. She wrote about Catherine's slow journey back toward light. And with each word, Eleanor discovered that the greatest redemption was not in being saved by someone else, but in saving herself, one honest sentence at a time. The woman who had suffered in silence had found her voice at last, and in that voice the world was transformed.